Hello everyone, I'm just going to be going over how to create and rig a really basic humanoid character so that I can pose them and have them walk across a very basic ground. I'm just going to start by making a really simple model. I want to make sure that I have a clear head, torso, upper arm, upper leg, lower leg, very simple feet, very simple hands. I'm not going very detailed because this is just a quick exercise to understand how this works so that you'll be able to do this for your own more detailed characters in the future. As I'm modeling, I'm just being strategic and making sure that everything is connected properly. So I'm making some adjustments to the size. I'm adding a lot of subdivision. I'm using proportional editing strategically. I'm extruding certain faces to make the limbs. If I was going to be joining multiple objects together, I want to be really strategic about it. I want to make sure that they're joined at the vertex level so that I don't end up with overlapping pieces. So the Boolean modifier could be a really good way to do that. But the important thing is that I end up where my model is fully connected at the vertex level. I don't have any gaps in the mesh, and I don't have any faces on the inside of the mesh. And from here, it's just, are there any other things that I want to do? I don't want to have a super detailed mesh because I don't want to be wasting a lot of time on this. This is really going to be just about the rigging process. So that's really the basics of the modeling stages. I do want to be really clear. You want to make sure that your vertices are all actually connected to each other. You don't want to have separate mesh objects. If you are going to start that way and join them together, use the Boolean modifier instead, like we did for the cup handle back in the day. So I'm just going to head back into object mode because this is just an exercise. I'm not going to worry about materials or anything. I am going to apply my mirror modifier, and I want to make sure that when I'm in the object settings over here, that the rotation and the scale are all 0 and 1. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to apply any transforms. So Control A for the apply menu. The location should be the center of the grid, but I can apply the rotation, the scale, all of the transforms, or in this case, maybe just rotation and scale. I don't actually have any rotation to worry about, but if I did, I could reset that right here. So that puts the scale to 1. It's important to have these applied for the rigging process. All right, so again, things that are important. Your character must be facing front in the front view. There are a lot of things that aren't going to work properly if that's not the case. Scale and rotation need to be applied. Again, there are things that won't work properly if that's not the case. Makes it a lot easier if you're modeling from the center of the grid at the starting point. The default cube is already there, so that just makes it pretty easy. All right, but now I'm ready to actually start rigging. I'm going to just move the pivot point with Shift S, or the cursor, to the world origin. And now I'm going to add my armature. Shift A for the add menu here in object mode. I'm going to add an armature. And we don't see anything right now because it got added inside of the mesh itself, but we can see there's this armature object that's been added into my human collection. Now we have some new settings down below in the properties panel. I'm going to go to the armature settings. Under viewport display, I'm going to turn on in front. That allows me to see my first bone. And I'm just going to slide this to the lower torso area. And that's where I'm going to really be starting from with the rig. Underneath the armature settings, we have the bone settings. And it's a really good idea to be naming your bones descriptively as you're going. I'm going to switch into edit mode so I can actually do some changes here. But I'm just going to name this bone L torso. So L is going to stand for lower. I could write it out all the way if I wanted, but that's something that's fine. Now, when I'm looking at the bone itself, at the top, I have the head or the tip of the bone. I have sort of the middle of the bone and then the base of the bone. If I'm selecting the tip just by right-clicking on it, I can press G to grab, to resize it or move it around or change the angle, When I'm doing that, I'll often press Z if I want to log it to the Z axis to keep it really straight. Then it's just a matter of making sure it's at a position that makes sense. When we're doing the rigging process, we're usually simplifying the bone structure a little bit, only adding bones where we actually need them, not replicating exactly what happens in real bodies. Now, if I want a connected bone, I'm just going to press E to extrude, and it gives me one that's connected to whichever one was selected last. And I'm going to just press Z to lock that to the Z axis. So I'm going to extrude. Well, actually, before I extrude, I'm going to name this. This is going to be U torso for upper torso. And then I'm going to extrude this again. Oh, let me fix the name here. Press enter to commit the change. There we go. All right, and if I feel like anything's in the wrong place, I can always just grab the bones and shift them around to adjust the location if I feel like something's not quite in the right spot. Something like this. This bone at the very top is going to be for the head. Again, upper torso, lower torso. I like to abbreviate just to make it a little bit easier. Now, from the front view, I'm just going to move the pivot location to the shoulder area, and I'm not actually going to make the bones on both sides of the body because I can duplicate them automatically for the other side as long as I name them properly and the orientation is set up properly and the various transforms have been applied. All right, so if I want to add a new bone that's not connected, it's just Shift A for the Add menu. Then I'm going to adjust the angle here. I might want to take a look from another viewpoint so I can make sure that this is positioned properly. So you might want to switch it to quad view or just change your viewpoint or pull out another window so that you can be looking from multiple views at the same time. Whatever makes sense for you, go for it. And if you want to get rid of another view, you just hover over the corner and override like that. All right, so this is going to be my upper arm, and I'm going to add .r at the end of the name for the right side of the body. I'm going to just extrude X to lock that to the X axis for the lower arm, renaming this descriptively. So L arm for lower arm, keeping the .r, and enter. And for the hand area, E to extrude one last time. This is going to be just hand.r. And if any of the placement seems off, I can adjust it, but that looks okay. Just one to go back into the front view. And I'm going to do the same thing for the leg. So at the top of the leg, I'm just moving the pivot point or the cursor. Shift A for the Add menu. The bone needs to go in the opposite direction. So I'm just going to do G to grab, Z to lock the movement to the Z axis, moving down to the knee area. I want to double check the actual position from multiple viewpoints. E to extrude, just going to lock it to the Z axis for now. Going to just add a little bit of a bend here as a starting point, and I feel like that's a little bit offset. Something like this looks pretty good, and actually maybe a little bit. And for the foot, E to extrude, just lock that to the Y axis as a starting point. Something like that for the foot. I need to go back and make sure that these are named properly. So U leg for upper leg, .r for the right side of the body, L leg, .r for the lower leg on the right side of the body, and then foot dot R for the right side of the foot. So again, I'm not going to worry about the left side of the armature for now. I'm just going to get everything working on the right side. So next up, I need to add some control bones that I can sort of grab onto to move and pose the armature. So I'm going to be going to sort of the wrist area between the hand and the lower arm. E to extrude. I'm going to press Y to lock that to the Y axis. So just checking that that's going the right direction. That all looks good. Naming this descriptively. So this is going to be arm IK dot R. IK stands for inverse kinematics, which is what allows you to grab onto the end of a limb to move the whole thing. So same thing with the foot. I'm just going to do E to extrude, Y to lock it to the Y axis, and this is going to be the leg. IK dot R. Now, when I'm setting up the inverse kinematics, I also need bones to control the rotation of the arms and the legs. So these are going to be sort of target bones. So I'm just going to go straight on from the front. In the elbow area between the upper arm and the lower arm, I'm just going to Shift A to add a new bone. Slide that a little further down. And this is way too close. I want this to be out of reach of the arm itself. So however long that arm is, put it a little bit further in front. So something like this. This is going to control the rotation of the arm, so we can think of it like an elbow. So I'm going to call this elbow dot R, again for the right side of the body. I'm going to do the exact same thing for the knee area. So in between the upper and lower leg, I'm just clicking to move the pivot point, Shift A for the add menu. I'm going to just slide that bone a little bit further down. And again, it's way too close. I'm going to put it about the same distance away, something like that. And this is going to be controlling the rotation of the leg, so we can think of it like the knee. So I'm just going to call it knee dot R. All right, next up, I'm going to make sure that my IK bones and my target bones don't have any other bones as a parent right now. So there are two ways we can do this. I can come under relations, and when I have the bone active, if there is a parent, I can clear it from here. So I'm just going to X out the parent from under relations over here. I could also press Option P to clear the parent from there, and you can see now that no longer has a parent. All right, so now it's time to actually get the IK settings working. I'm going to switch from edit mode into this new mode called pose mode that works specifically for the armature. So if I grab onto a bone and press G, I can see how it's moving, but right now only one bone moves at a time unless there's something that's parented to it, and it's not necessarily in a way that's really intuitive. Like if I try to move the hand, not much happens. If I try to move the IK bone, it doesn't do anything with the arm. So I need to get these working together properly. Now, I want to be really specific about the order that I'm selecting here. I'm going to select the IK bone first, then hold down on Shift and select the lower arm. So you can see the lower arm has the brighter outline. And I'm going to use Shift, Control, C to add a constraint, specifically inverse kinematics. If I've done this correctly, the lower arm turns green, and whenever I select on the lower arm, underneath the bone settings, I have these bone constraints specifically for the IK. Now there's some initial setup that I need to do. I'm going to come over to the pole target and choose the armature, and the bone that's right here is going to be the target bone that's in front. So in this case, it's going to be the elbow. Now, the chain length is the number of bones that the IK bone is controlling. In this case, it's going to be 2. So if everything is set up properly, now I can grab onto my IK bone and the entire arm is moving. Now we can see it's actually bending back the wrong direction. So if I come over into edit mode, I can just grab the connection between the upper and lower arm, so sort of the elbow area. I'm just going to encourage it to bend the right direction, so just pulling that joint a little bit back. Now when I go back into pose mode, you can see how that's changed in the direction that the arm is moving. And if I want to go back to the original pose, I can select everything with A and then clear the transforms to go back to the initial version of my armature. So something like that. You may find, like if you're taking a look between edit mode and pose mode, you may find sometimes that the angle ends up a little bit off, and that's going to be the pole angle over here. So I can make some corrections to the pole angle. Most often, this is 90 degrees or multiples of 90, so 90, negative 90, 180, negative 180, and something like that. And I might need to come back here later on and change that, but that is going to give me a much more predictable and controllable arm. And this allows me again to adjust the angle of the elbow. There we go. I'm going to do the exact same thing for the legs. So I'm selecting the IK bone first, shift selecting the lower leg. It has that lighter outline. Shift Control C for the constraint menu. I'm turning on inverse kinematics. Need to do the same setup. Pull target is the same armature. The bone is going to be the knee. This is going to be moving 2 bones, so chain length goes up to 2. We can see that the angle of the bone is wrong, so I need to correct the pull target. Again, it's usually multiples of 90. In this case, it looks like it's probably 180. So now if I move the IK bone, my entire leg is moving. Because I already added a little bit of a bend originally in edit mode, it bends exactly the way that I want it to. And I can control the direction of the knee with the target bone. Now, at this point, I can't really control what my foot is doing. So I'm going to do a little bit of adjusting to the foot and allow this to have a different constraint. So first of all, I'm actually going to set the IK bone as the controller or the parent of the foot. So I'm going to select the foot first, shift right click to select the IK bone, Control P, and oh, I need to be in edit mode for this. So foot selected first, shift right click to select the bone. You can see it has the yellow outline, so that's active. Control P, and I'm going to choose keep offset. Now when I go back into pose mode, when I move the IK bone, it moves the foot. The benefit to that is now I can rotate the IK bone and I have complete control over what the foot is doing based on that. But I don't want the foot to be able to move completely freely like this. It should stay connected to the leg. So I'm going to add another constraint. Now I do want to be very strategic about the order. So I'm going to select the lower leg first, shift right click, select the foot second, and the constraint menu again, so shift control C. And this time I'm going to limit the distance. The foot here is going to turn green, and if everything is working properly, I can move the IK bone, but the foot stays connected to the leg, but I can still adjust the tilt and the rotation. So I have more control over what's happening. So at this point, I can adjust the legs, I can adjust the arms. They're really nice and easy to move, but I can't move the armature as a whole. I want to make sure that my upper arm and my upper leg are actually connected to the torso so that I'll be able to move these together later on. So I'm just going to do the same thing for parenting. selecting the upper leg, shift right click, selecting the lower leg. It has that brighter outline. And actually this, again, I need to be in edit mode for this step. So it has that yellow outline. Control P, keep offset. You see this little dashed line representing the relationship there. I'm going to do the same thing for the upper arm and the upper torso. So shift right click to select both. The upper torso is the one with the yellow outline because that's going to be the parent. Control P, keep offset. So now when I come over, if I make changes to the torso bones, it actually impacts the arms and the legs, which they should do. So that is much better there. All right, so that is all the setup on the right side of the body. So back in edit mode, something really cool that I can do is just select all of my bones on the right side over here. And in the armature menu, I can symmetrize the bones. And now I have these perfect copies. So if I look at the names of the bones, exact same names, just with .l at the end of the name. So naming is really important if you want Symmetrize to work. Again, there are a few different things that need to happen to use Symmetrize. You need to be having your character face the front in the front view. So when you press 1 and you're looking in the front view, your model is facing front. You're modeling from the center of the grid. For the object settings for the mesh object, the rotation is set to 0 because the rotation has been applied if it was changed. The scale is set to 1 because the scale has been applied if it's been changed. And then naming your bones themselves properly. So having the .r at the end of the name if it's on the right side, or .l at the end of the name if it's on the left side. Without all of these pieces, Symmetrize is going to fail, and then you're going to need to take the extra time to do those steps manually. But now my armature is pretty much set. I do want to add just one additional bone though that can move the entire armature at once if I want it to. So I'm just going to go back into the front view, somewhere between the legs. I'm just going to set the pivot point, Shift A to add another bone. I'm just going to adjust the location and the angle, maybe something like this. And this is just going to be called control. And when I parent everything properly, moving this one bone will move the entire armature at once without changing the pose itself. So the lower torso is going to be a child, so selecting that first, control bone last, control P, keep offset. I'm going to do the same thing for all of my target bones, selecting the control bone last, control P, keep offset. I need to do this for the IK bones as well. Selecting the control bone last, control P, keep offset. If I've done this correctly, when I go into pose mode, if I select the control bone, the entire moves freely when I press G to grab it. And I'm just going to undo that move. I think that head is a little bit too tilted, so I'm just going to adjust that like that. All right, now at this point I have a completed armature and I have my mesh, but the armature isn't moving the mesh right now. So I'm going to need to do that. All right, I've just realized that there's one last thing that I should do to my armature. So I'm going to head back into edit mode, and all of my IK bones in the bone settings, I'm just going to turn deform off because they are moving other bones. They're not moving any part of the mesh directly. So my control bone should have deform off. My 4 IK bones should have deform off. There we go. So at this stage, I can move the armature itself, but the mesh isn't moving with it. So now I want to actually make the mesh move. I'm going to select the mesh first and the armature second. So shift right click. The armature has that yellow outline, so I know I selected in the right order. Control P to set a parent. We have a lot of options here. I'm specifically choosing armature deform with automatic weights. Now, on a really good day, it's going to set the parent, and it'll be creating, if we take a look at the mesh, it actually creates a vertex group for each of the bones, which is really helpful. And on a really good day, I'm going to select the armature first, the mesh second, and head into this weight paint mode. And on a really good day, when I move everything around, the mesh is weighted properly so that each bone is impacting different vertices. Now, the target bones, the control bone, the IK bone, they shouldn't be changing everything. They shouldn't have vertex groups because deform was turned off. So they're not going to be impacting everything. But the rest of the bones, they are. Now this dark blue means that these vertices aren't moving, they're not impacted by the bone. When it's red, it's moving freely. And then anything in between might be influenced by the bone, and it could be a lot or it could be a little. In this case, the weight painting did a decent job. Everything is moving. If I move the entire armature, the whole mesh moves. When I move each individual limb, the limb moves. So it's looking pretty good. Now, there are definitely some areas that are maybe moving a little bit more than I want them to. So I might go in and spend a little bit of time correcting the weight painting so that things that I want to be stationary will stay stationary, or things that I want to move more will move more. But I'll go over that in just a moment. I do want to mention sometimes the weight painting will fail completely. It will create these empty vertex groups for you, but nothing will actually be assigned to the vertex groups. And that's because there's some sort of problem with the geometry or with the rig. Having those descriptive names really makes a difference. If there's something that's unexpected in the armature, it might be more likely to fail. All right, so if it does fail, or if we need to do corrections, there are two ways that we can do that. Now, if this failed completely, I recommend getting a starting point by going over into edit mode, specifically looking at the wireframe view. Now right now, if I click on one of my vertex groups and then the select button over here, I can see the vertices that are impacted by that particular bone or by that vertex group. So if I needed to, I could select a vertex group, select the vertices that I want to be part of that group, and then I can just assign them a weight. So it's going to set a weight of 1 by default, but I could just assign like this, and when I switch back into weight paint over here, depending on what it was before, I could see a different approach. But I think that's pretty much exactly what was going on before. And so from edit mode, you can just keep going from bone to bone, selecting the vertices that you want to impact the bone, and then assigning them with the weight that you want. One, again, is to move freely. And you can actually do the reverse as well. If you realize that there are some vertices that you don't want to have impacted at all, you can select those vertices and then remove them completely from the group. All right, so that is option 1 for making corrections or starting the weight painting from scratch. Option 2 is actually working directly in this weight paint mode. So weight paint has a few different tools that we can work with. First of all, definitely make sure if you're going to be doing weight painting, it's really important that you get into it correctly. So armature selected first, mesh selected second. Then when we get into weight paint mode, We can select the different bones, see how they're impacting, and also move things around. Now, when we're in this weight paint mode, if we want to make corrections to the weight painting because the weight painting failed, or they're just areas that aren't quite right. Like, for example, this upper arm over here, it's impacting a lot of the torso, and I probably don't want it to impact quite as large of an area as it's currently doing. So that might be something that I want to come in and make corrections to. Now, I do have some additional weight paint settings. If I come over to the tool properties over here, like there is a symmetry option. And so I can specifically mirror the vertex groups, and in this case, it's mirroring. So if I make a change on this side, it also makes the change on the other side. That's another reason having everything named properly is really important. Now, I don't want to increase the weight over here. I actually want to decrease it. So I can change the weight that I'm painting to 0 if I want to completely remove the influence. Now, you'll notice that the weight painting is based on the vertex location. So sometimes if you're not seeing the result that you're looking for when you're painting, it might just be you're trying to paint where there's not actually a vertex. So that'll have an impact there. So we can see saving a ton of time since I have a symmetrical design by having this symmetry option enabled over here. Now, I don't necessarily have to keep just weighting to 0 or weighting to 1. I can do a partial weight in between. So if I want it to be more gradual, I can adjust that. Now, I find weight painting with the brush sometimes a little fussier than I might actually want it to be. So I often like to use this gradient option down here. Now, the linear option I don't really like. When you start clicking and dragging, it goes across the entire mesh. So I feel like you have less control. I'm just going to undo that with Command C. The radial option, however, is really helpful. I'm going to put the weight down to 0, but leave the strength at 1. And so now you can see it starts gradually filling in with the gradient of weight so that I can start having a little bit more control over the exact transition that I'm going to end up with. Now this is maybe going a little bit too far, so I might switch back to the brush, give it some weight, and I do want to make sure that the vertices that are part of the arm are all selected. But now, when I'm moving, you can see less of the upper torso is moving when I don't want it to. Now, there's still maybe an area over here that I might want to go in and correct. So with this selected, yeah, you can see there's a little bit of light right over there. Just going to put the weight down to 1 and erase that. And now when I'm moving my arm here, a lot less of the torso is moving when I don't want it to move. So I'm a lot happier with that behavior. And because of the symmetry option, when I move the other arm, it's behaving the same way. And if, again, there are areas that I feel like still need adjustment, I can go in and I can keep correcting them. So you can do your weight painting entirely in weight paint mode, either with the brush or the gradient. You can also smear if you want to have a better blending between the edges, if that's something that you need. Or you can do it over in edit mode, specifically wireframe and assigning and removing various weights to the vertices. Now, something I do want to mention is weight painting is significantly easier if you don't have vertices on the inside of the mesh itself. All right, so my character is all posed and ready to go. There is one last thing I want to do to the armature before I start going through the actual animation stage, and I'm going to show you how to do a walk cycle in a couple minutes. I'm just going to go back into edit mode. All right, so I don't need to actually see the bones in the arms or the legs because they're going to be moved by the IK bones. They're just sort of distracting. So I'm just going to select all of them just with Shift right click, and then I'm just going to press M to move them to a new collection, and I'm just going to call this hidden and create. And so now when I don't want these active, I can just hide them. So there we go. So now it's just the bones that I need to see. Now at this stage, I'm going to go through how to do a walk cycle so that you have a single step of your character that can then be repeated and animated actually changing location. So this is something that helps you to animate a walk more efficiently. Now, just to make it a little bit more clear what's going on, I'm going to be adding a really basic ground plane just with Shift A, scaling that up a little bit. And I'm also just going to scale along the y-axis so that I have an area to actually walk on. All right, there we go. So I do want to make sure that the feet aren't sinking through the ground plane at this stage. And you can see they are coming just a little bit through. Now my feet aren't perfectly flat, so I would probably, if this was something I really cared about, I would take a little bit of time to flatten out the feet. But there we go. I'm just going to head into pose mode for the armature. And my first pose is what we call the contact pose. And so the arms and legs are going opposite directions, and this is just mid-step. So I'm just going to actually maybe use the transform widget here. The front foot, the heel, is going to be on the ground, about like that. And the back foot is going to have the toes on the ground. So something like that. And then the arms are going to be swinging opposite directions from the legs. So this is probably going to be a couple of movements. Also going to move the target bone for the elbow to correct that rotation there. Same sort of thing for my other arm, but this one is going to be coming forward, again, opposite of what the leg is doing. And I can move my elbow as needed. So sometimes it's a few different moves to get the exact behavior that I want. And the torso itself is, the upper torso is going to rotate a little bit in the direction that the arms are moving. So it's going to tilt towards the arm that's in front. So something like this might just pull the torso a little bit further down so that this foot can come a little bit more down. Okay, so something like this for the contact pose. And the more extreme I move my limbs, the more exaggerated the walk is going to be. So that's something to experiment with. I'm going to head over into the animation workspace, and I'm just going to press A to select all of my bones, and I'm going to press I to add my first keyframe. I am going to turn on the record button so that it's keeping track of what I'm doing, but for now, I just have my first keyframe with that contact pose. I want my first and last keyframe to do the same. I'm going to do a 32 frame walk cycle. You could do any number of frames. Your numbers just might end up being a little bit different for the additional poses. And then just I to add the same keyframe. And I'm going to right click just on the top key over here to select the entire column, Command C to copy, and at the midway point, So frame 16, I'm going to paste a flipped version. So it's Shift Command V to paste the flipped version of the pose, or I could do paste flipped from the menu over here. And I do want to make sure that all of the bones have a keyframe. You can see there are a few that aren't right now because they didn't actually move. So I'm just going to add I while I'm hovering to add a keyframe here. So this is the most basic version of the walk cycle. And actually, I'm going to change the end frame here to 32 temporarily so that when I play through, I can just see this looping. And so it's a good start, but it doesn't feel really realistic yet. So I'm going to add some additional poses that's going to make the walk feel more realistic and believable. So at the midway point between the contact and the inverse contact pose, we have what's called the passing pose. And so this is where the foot from the back is passing into the front. So the foot that's coming from the back is going to be slightly raised with the toe hitting the ground. So actually pretty similar to what this is right now. Just going to grab the transform tool again because I think that's the easiest one to use. So I'm just tilting the foot down. So that looks about right. And then the foot on the other side is going to be solidly on the ground. So that looks about right. The arms are fairly close to the body. They're just sort of mid-swing. And just, again, staying pretty close to the body itself. So passing pose. Now, just like before, I need the inverse version of the passing pose. So I'm just going to press A to select everything. And actually, in this case, I'm going to add my keyframes for all of the bones. So I, to make sure all of those have a keyframe. Just like before, I'm selecting all of the keys in this column by right-clicking on the top, Command-C to copy, and then I'm going to paste the inverse version midway between the inverse contact pose and the final contact pose. So that's Shift-Command-V. One thing I want to mention before I go any further is that pasting flipped is only going to work if you have your rigging set up properly. So if you have your character modeled facing the front in the front view when you're pressing 1 on the number pad, that is something that's going to help this work. Having descriptive names where you have the .L or the .R at the end of the bone name is going to help make this work. So if you don't have everything set up properly from the beginning, it might cause some issues. I can see I have a few missing keyframes here, so I'm just going to press I to make sure there's a key for all of my bones at this stage. So that's not going to be a huge change. Descent pose, which is going to be halfway between the first contact pose and the passing pose. So in this case, that's frame 4. And so the lower torso is going to come a little bit down. The front foot is going to be firmly on the ground. And the back foot is going to be up in the air. Arms are still just swinging. If I feel like I'm not happy with the position, I can make adjustments to them. For now, I'm going to leave it. A to select everything so all of my keyframes are visible. I'm going to right-click on my top keyframe for frame 4, Command-C to copy, and then frame 20, which is halfway between my inverse contact pose and my inverse passing pose, is where I'm going to paste with Shift-Command-V the flipped version of my pose. And so I can play through, see how that looks. I can see that for whatever reason there are a couple of keyframes, or in this case just the one keyframe that didn't paste flipped. So I can always come over here to that, copy that individually, and paste that flipped. There we go. I don't know why it didn't do it automatically. So we can see how that's going so far. All right, next up we have the high point pose, and that's halfway between the passing pose and the inverse passing pose. So in this case, frame 12. And so the foot that is forward is going to be in the air, and the foot that is behind, well, actually, the torso is going to be slightly up, and then the foot that's on the ground is going to be toes down and then in the air. I just want to make sure that's not going through too far. There we go. Again, if I'm not happy with the positions of the arms, I can always come back in and change that. For now, I'm just going to leave it and see how it looks. A to select everything. I'm going to right click on the top key to select all of them. Command C to copy, and then halfway between the inverse passing pose and the final contact pose, which is frame 28, I'm going to paste flipped. And again, we have that one keyframe that didn't paste for whatever reason, so I'm just going to copy and paste that over. So Command C to copy, and then Shift Command V to paste flipped. And so now I can play through and see that walk. Now, this fella has sort of a lively sort of step going on. If I like it, I can just leave it. And if there are any areas that I want to come back in and refine, I can do that. I can make adjustments wherever I want to adjust. I think I'm just going to go with it. So I'm just going to pause this. I'm going to extend my end frame back to something like 250. And I'm going to just switch the view of the dope sheet to the action editor. I'm going to give my walk action a descriptive name, and I'm going to push it down to the NLA editor. And again, we can come over to the camera view over here and change it to nonlinear animation, or NLA. And I can specify how many times I want my action clip to repeat, so how many steps I want my character to take. So for now, maybe I want 10 steps. So when I play through, my character is walking. Now, to actually animate my character going across this space, I'm going to be doing that in object mode. And it's going to be specifically a action changing location. So I have my walk cycle. This is going to be an action specifically for the location. Now, before I do anything with that, I'm just going to come over to my ground plane here, and I'm going to just make it a little less flat. So W to subdivide, I'm going to increase the number of cuts, and I'm going to come back in and do that a couple of different times here so that I'm going to have a ground that isn't perfectly flat after I come in with some strategic proportional editing. If I keep this perfectly flat while I'm animating, you're not going to see the sort of corrections that you need to make sometimes depending on what your ground surface is like. So just adding a little bit of dimension there to my ground. So on my first frame, I'm going to grab my armature and just move it to wherever my starting location is going to be. Again, I like to use the transform tool for something like this. And I want to make sure that my feet are in contact with the ground. I might need to do a little bit of an adjustment, but I can experiment with what makes sense. So perhaps something like that. I have record on, so it automatically added keyframe. And right now, my character is just walking in place. Now, I'm going to have my character walk all the way across the ground plane. I'm going to come over to frame 311 here, and I am just going to slide the location forward. When I'm doing some sort of action, I like to do the start and ending positions first, and then I'll go back in and make corrections. So over here, I'm going to need to come up a little bit. I might benefit from adjusting the rotation. Maybe it's okay. The feet shouldn't be going through the ground at all. So again, sometimes it's adjusting both the rotation and the position. And maybe a little bit more back. So that's really close. So something about like that. And I'm just going to change the ending location and zoom out so we can see this a little bit more clearly and play through and see what's going on. So my character is moving forward across the ground plane. They're moving sort of in place a little bit at the start and at the end of my movement. So that's something that I can probably adjust in a couple different ways. If I come down into the action editor, Control Tab opens up the curve editor, and I've only really changed the Y location for now. So if I adjust the handles so that this becomes a straighter transition, that might be beneficial. Maybe I do want to have some of the more curved transition. Maybe I don't. Matter personal preference, but that's looking a lot better. All right, just going to use Control Tab to get back into the normal view here. And I'm going to take a moment just to set up my camera view. And going to come back to the original collection and the camera. I'm just going to add a constraint to track the camera to the armature so that it is following Jerry around. So I'm just going to switch over to the camera view. Yeah, so the feet are definitely sinking through the ground at different points. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go through and at various points, wherever the feet should be in contact with the ground but aren't, I'm going to correct the vertical position just with the move or the transform tool. And anywhere that the feet are going through the ground and they shouldn't be, I'll be correcting that location as well. Actually, the control bone is sort of in the way here. I'm not going to use it right now, so I'm just going to, in edit mode, move that to the hidden collection, and I can turn the visibility back on when I need it. All right, that's going to be a little bit easier to work with here. So again, anywhere the feet are going through, I'm going to correct the position. And if it's a pose where the feet should be on the ground and in contact with the ground, I'm just going to correct that and make sure that the feet are contacting the ground wherever they need to. And so it's just a matter of adding strategic keyframes just where you need them. And you definitely want to make sure that the overall timing is right before you do that. Sometimes it's going to be a matter of adjusting the rotation. I know that frame 16 is the contact pose pretty much, so that should be a little bit more in contact. This looks like it might be might be about right, so I think I'll keep moving. And I'm just going to keep scrubbing through, and anywhere the foot position is off, I'm just going to make corrections to it. And again, if my feet were actually flat, that would probably make a difference. Sometimes the feet actually need to come a little bit lower to be in contact with the ground. So let's see how that's going so far. Not bad. So I'm not going to take the time to get the entire sequence corrected, but I think that that's looking pretty good. But that's the basics of doing a walk cycle. I do want to mention that you can certainly add other actions to your character if that's something that you wanted to do. So let's say I'm done with just this change in location. I can push it down to the NLA editor. I can come back over to pose mode so that I'm targeting my what's currently in my walking track right now. And let's say at the very end of the animation, I want to add some more, and maybe my character is going to start doing something else. And so they're going to move from this contact pose into another action. Maybe they're just going to be stopping and standing. So some number of frames over, I might start just making some changes. Maybe the feet are going to go into the passing pose because the passing pose is just really close to standing. So if I start moving, or actually, the first thing I would want to do is wherever my last pose ended up, I probably want to have a keyframe on that frame just as my starting point. So A to select all, I to insert my first keyframe. And so now I have maybe by frame 324, it's just going to be into, or I guess every 4 frames. So frame 315 would be the descent pose, and 319 might be my passing pose. The arms might be going closer to the body, maybe relaxing a little bit. Maybe the torso straightening out a little bit compared to before. And then some number of frames over, this foot is going to end up flat on the ground, and I can continue doing any other changes that I want to do for this new action. I'm just going to call this standing. Now I can push it down. I want to make sure that I'm keeping my different actions on the correct tracks. So everything for pose mode should be on the same track. Anything from object mode for that object should be on a separate track. So now my character is going to be walking forward. When they reach the end location, let me correct my ending frame here. So my character is walking forward. When they reach the end location, they move into stopping. And I might want to add an additional keyframe for the location, moving them just a little bit more forward after the walk. But generally speaking, that is the process. Take advantage of how the NLA editor works so that you can have different actions that are saved so that you can adjust the timing of them independently without needing to work with all the keyframes individually. Loop your walk so that it repeats multiple times so that you can just change the location in object mode and add keyframes that way so that you don't have to literally add every single keyframe for every single step. That just takes way too long. All right, so I think that is it for today.